Good morning to everyone. To those of you that have joined us on Zoom, Boker Tov. To those of you on Facebook Live, good morning. And to those of you who are going to be watching this a little bit later, welcome back to Practical Parsha. Must I do everything myself is the question of today. We're living in a generation, in a time when life is so hectic and so busy that the advisors out there, the coaches out there, are suggesting to delegate more because the responsibilities are so intense that it becomes a juggling game. And people aren't capable of juggling everything all the time. And so relying on others to assist in the process and to delegate is a skill. Be able to empower others to be able to do work on our behalf. So this is going to be a discussion of ours today in our Practical Parsha discussion. It's focused on the world of education. That's the discussion today, the world of education, of chinuch, because one can ask the question, does the same principle apply? When we talk about delegating and empowering others and having others assist us, will the same rule apply to us in this particular case? Delegate. Do we delegate education? Or maybe education needs to be done by the parents themselves. I'm not yet talking about teachers in education. I'm talking about parents within their realm of parenthood and the responsibility of education. We have a verse in this week's Torah portion. Last week, we had the first Parsha of the Shema. Right? Shema and Va'ahavta appeared in last week's Parsha, Parshas Ve'eschanan. This week in Parshas Eikev, we have reference to the second Parsha of the Shema, Va'aya im shamoa tishma'u. Right? It will be when you listen to my mitzvot that I command you. And here we mention the phrase, and let me quote from the Torah's portion this week, you should teach your children, to discuss them, to talk about Torah, when you sit at home, and you're traveling on the way, and when you're lying down, and when you're getting up. This is the phrase that talks about education. You should listen, you should teach, right, your children. Who's responsible to teach the children? The parents are responsible to teach the children. That's what the pasuk is saying. You should teach your children. So the responsibility of education actually stems from the parents. Now let me ask you, is that the mindset of today's generation? Today's generation, we rely on the school system. The school's responsible to educate. And how much this has become a challenge during COVID and lockdowns, when children have been stuck at home on their screens and parents have now been asked to step in. Because if the children are studying at home on their devices, the school can't possibly watch them all and assist them all and guide them all. So the schools have turned to the parents once again and said to the parents, chip in here. You're used to dropping off your kids at school at 7:30 in the morning and picking them up at 3, whatever the time may be. But now your kids are back at home. There's no choice. COVID has struck, third wave or whatever the case may be. I need your assistance now. We need your assistance now. And you know what this has done to parenthood? Wow, this has shaken up the whole concept because parents are so used to relying on the school system. The school system, I'm not blaming parents. The way society has developed is that parents go to work and children go to school. And that's where they're educated. But is that what Torah had in mind? Torah had in mind that parents are responsible for the education of their children. That's where the mitzvah lies. The mitzvah, education, let's just clarify this. Education isn't only about, we've got to empower the younger generation. We're going to empower the younger generation. It's about parents taking responsibility for the education of their children. That's what education is about. And so the verse says, teach your children. Well, The question we've got to ask ourselves is, must we do it ourselves? That's the question. Is that what the Torah had in mind, that we should do it ourselves? So let me quote to you a piece of Talmud from Tractate Baba Batra, where the Gemara discusses this. And the Gemara says an interesting thing. He says, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav says, this person should be remembered for good. Who's this person? This person is Yehoshua ben Gamla. Yehoshua ben Gamla should be remembered for good. What's unique about Yehoshua ben Gamla? So, Yehoshua ben Gamla was the high priest shortly before the destruction of the Second Temple. He was known to be part of a group called the Prussian, or the Pharisees, who actually opposed the revolt against the Romans, and he was murdered by the zealots of the Jewish community for his stance. He suggested, don't fight back, it's not worth your while, and he was actually murdered as a result. So Rabbi Yehuda Amar Rav is saying that Yehoshua ben Gamla should be remembered for good. Why remembered for good? He says, if not for him, Torah would have been forgotten. Not for Yehoshua ben Gamla, Torah would have been forgotten. Why? And I quote the Talmud. Initially, whoever had a father would learn Torah from him. And whoever did not would not learn Torah at all. Interesting, the Talmud says the father, because that's the way it was. The father was responsible for the education of his children. In today's times, thank God, our women are much more educated than ever before, and women actually play a very important role in the education of their children. So I think we can extrapolate it to the words of the Talmud and apply it to our modern world, where father and mother play a role in the education of their children. So listen to the wording. Initially, whoever had a father would learn Torah from him, and whoever did not would not learn Torah at all. Based on what verse did they do so? Right? Where does it say so? And it says they interpreted the verse. You should teach them to your children. To mean you yourselves should teach the children. That's what the verse says. The parents are responsible. That's the way it was. And if you didn't have a parent, in that case, you didn't have a father, but let's say you didn't have a mother, so you didn't have parents to educate you, what would happen to you? Nothing. Zero. No one took responsibility in days of old because the Torah says do it yourself. And if you're not around because you've passed on, well, then your children suffered. But listen what happened. Then they instituted that schools be established in Jerusalem. So suddenly now the school system, can you imagine the school system goes back to the times of the Second Temple, 2,000 years. But remember, in Jewish circles, and I'm not sure what academic science or papers would say about this, but 2,000 years ago, in the times of the Second Temple, there weren't Jewish day schools. Interesting, hey? Even though we do know that Mordechai, in the times of the Purim story, did have a cheder of children. Okay, that's interesting. So Mordechai, already in Persia, we have record of Mordechai learning Torah with the children. We also have record of the children in the story of Hanukkah, back in Israel, right? Also had chadorim of sorts where they would learn together. But going back a little before then, there wasn't record of Jewish day schools. Why? Because every father taught their child. But then they changed it. And they instituted Jewish day schools. Okay? And I'm going to continue reading the Talmud. Then they instituted that schools be established in Jerusalem. Based on what verse? So where did they get that idea from? Who introduced that concept of a Jewish day school? And they quoted the verse that said, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah. Because Torah emerges from Zion. Torah has to come from Yerushalayim. In this case, Zion, Zion, is a reference to Jerusalem. Torah must stem from Jerusalem. Torah must come from Yerushalayim. And if a father can't provide that to his children, then Yerushalayim and the school system in Yerushalayim would provide that education. Continues the Talmud, but still, whoever had a father, the father would bring him to Jerusalem to study. But whoever did not have a father didn't go, because the father wasn't around to take his child to Jerusalem. Then they instituted Then they instituted that schools be established in every region, and students would be enrolled at age 16 or 17. So in every region, now you had Jewish day schools, not just in Jerusalem, in every region. What age group? 16 and 17. Then the Talmud continues. However, if a teacher grew angry at a student, he would rebel and leave. This state of affairs continued until Yoshua ben Gamla came and instituted that schools be established in every province and in every town, and children would be enrolled at age 6 or 7. This is the Yoshua ben Gamla's revolution. Don't just rely on Jerusalem. Don't just rely on every school in every region accepting 16 or 17-year-olds. Why? Because 16 or 17 is too late. Because at 16 or 17, if you try to enforce discipline, they push back. They push back and they leave. Right? They leave because they can't handle the pressure. So Yoshua ben Gamla says, hold on. First of all, we've got to enroll the children at age 6 or 7 when they're younger. Number one. And number two, it's got to be a school in every single province, in every single town. We've got to have a Jewish day school to educate the children so that if a child is an orphan, doesn't have parents, or let's extrapolate that a little bit more. If the parents are busy or at work, unable to educate their children, the children shouldn't suffer. Because the children deserve to have the chinuch and the education, and therefore the Jewish day school system will help educate the children. That's a phenomenal revolution of Yoshua ben Gamla. So what Rav Yehuda, in the name of Rav, was saying was, we need to complement Yoshua ben Gamla. But because of him, and because of his initiation of the school system, we now have Torah for all generations. Let us keep in mind that Yoshua ben Gamla's suggestion of establishing Jewish day schools wasn't there to exempt parents from their responsibility. So yes, we spoke about the orphan who doesn't have a father or mother to educate. Okay, so there's no one there to enforce education. But let's assume that a person has parents. And now Yoshua ben Gamla has established Jewish day schools. So now what happens? The risk of Yoshua ben Gamla's institution is that 1,000 or 2,000 years down the line, what's happened? We assume that the school is now responsible for educating our children. And the school must do that, and the school must do this, and the school's not performing, and the school's not doing that. And I'm paying so much tuition, and the school isn't or isn't doing. That's how parents talk these days. What happens? We feel we've now given over our responsibility as parents of educating children, and we're saying it's your duty to educate the kids because you're the Jewish day school. That's not what the Torah had in mind. And I believe it's not what Yoshua ben Gamla had in mind either. When Yoshua ben Gamla instituted Jewish day schools, it wasn't to exempt parents of the responsibility of education. You can't, because the verse says clearly in the verse in this week's Parsha of Vahayam Shema, "V'limadtem otam et bneichem." You have to educate the children. The responsibility is on the parents. It's similar to the Brit Milah, to the circumcision, right? Whose job is it to circumcise a child? Many people think it's the job of the mohel. The mohel is the one that circumcises a child. Well, the mohel does, but in actual fact, it's the father and the mother who's responsible in circumcising a child. We just nominate or appoint a mohel to be our shaliach, right? He's our representative, but the responsibility lies on us. That's where the responsibility lies, not on somebody else. And so it is with the day school as well. The chinuch and education of our children. It's our responsibility. We just then appoint the schools to act on our behalf as well. We have in this verse of Vahayam Shema, I want to highlight certain important phrases or verses that I think are very relevant. One of the phrases we say is Vahaya im Shema tishma'u. It will be if you listen to my commandments, which I command you. Have you ever noticed that there's a double terminology here? Shema tishma'u. to play. It's a double phrase. The verse could have easily said, V'haya im shamoa, or V'haya im tishma'u. It will be when you will listen to my mitzvahs, and I will then give you rain in its right time, and you'll have your harvest and your grain and your fields and your produce. What shamoa tishma'u? Listen to what Rashi writes. Rashi says, why does it say tishma twice? Shamoa tishma'u. He says, because each one of the listening, each phrase of listening, of hearing, whether it's shamoa or whether it's tishma'u, is referring to the following. Rashi says, if you will listen to the old, you will then listen to the new. But if you start to forget the old, then you will forget everything. That's the hint of the double terminology. You must listen to the old, and then you will listen to the new. If you start to forget the old, then you will not absorb and listen to the new. What does that mean? Well, many want to say that Judaism has to be relevant and applicable to today's generation. We've got to find the way Judaism talks to our modern times, to the youth of today, to the society of today, to the science and technology of today, which is so true. Torah has to be relevant and eternal for all generations. But the question is, does it come at a risk of the authentic, original principles and values of Torah? That's the question. And in many cases, in many instances, people think that if we embrace a modern version of Torah and the way Torah is applied and relevant to today, it's got to be in the exclusion of days of old. Let's get rid of old values, old principles, because we're living in a new world. And because we live in a new world, therefore the principles of old are no longer relevant. God is warning us. Moshe Rabbeinu is warning us. If you get rid of the old, even the new will fall apart. Because the new and the more relevant is dependent on the principles of old. You have to have the principles of old, the authentic Judaism as it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, as it was put into the Torah, as it was given to the generations in the Midbar, in the desert, and those who entered Israel. You've got to have that. That's the cornerstone of Jewish religion and Jewish faith and Jewish values. And then, based on that foundation, you can then establish a more modern, contemporary approach to Torah. But if you forget the old, you will no longer be left with anything of the new. And that's the phrase, Im shamoa tishma'u. If you will listen to the old, you will listen to the new. If you think you're going to get rid of the old, you won't be left with anything of the new. How important this message is to our children, our children's children, and to the new generation is, yes, we have to embrace you. Yes, we have to cater for you, but you also have to be able to acknowledge and appreciate where you're coming from, your origin, the authentic Judaism, the way it started back way then, 2,000 years ago. Many of the phrases in the Parsha Vayam Shamoa are actually a repeat of the first paragraph of the Shema in V'ahavta. Okay, so in V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, this is the paragraph of last week, which is the first paragraph of the Shema, which was mentioned in the Parsha of Et Hanan. It says like this. Let me just share with you some of the similarities. V'shinantam levanecha, and teach them to your children. V'dibarta bam, and speak to them. Sounds familiar, right? This is a quote from last week's Parsha. Now we have the same quote in this week's Parsha. We also have phrase to ukshatam leot ayadecha, tie the tefillin on your arm, or write the mezuzahs on your doorposts. So what is the difference between last week and this week? And the answer is quite a fundamental difference. The Parsha V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha is talking about the individual. V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha is singular form. You should love Hashem, your God, individual. B'chol levavecha, with all your heart, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol me'odecha. It's speaking to the individual. Moshe Rabbeinu first addresses the individual, because before we start with the public or the community or the tzibur or the kehillah, we first need to start with the individuals. That's the first phrase. First, I need to assess myself. First, I need to ask myself, where do I stand? What's my role? What's my purpose? Only when you have individuals who are like-minded in such a way, then you bring them together and you create the kehillah. Right? You don't start from the kehillah and then go back into the individual. You start with the individuals and then you go into the kehillah. So really, each individual needs to assess, where do I stand? What are my values? What's important to me? How am I educating my children? How am I educating my family? Okay, so it starts with the individual, as the Parsha of last week, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. It starts with the individual, it starts with the family, and then we bring the families together and the individuals together. And what do we create? We create a sense of kehillah, a sense of a community. So by the time we come to this week's Parsha, now we're talking to the plural. Vayayim shamoa tishme'u, plural. When you will listen, b'chol levavechem, you'll serve God with all your hearts. V'chol nafshechem, and with all your souls. It's now plural. It's now talking to the community. And you'll see throughout the paragraph, the second paragraph of the Shema, Vayam Shamoa, it's in plural. It's an important lesson that first we must assess ourselves and understand, where do I hold? What are my values and the values of my family? That's the most important. The cornerstone of Jewish faith is the family. Before the shul, before the community comes my family. Because as we'll explain, where does education begin? Where's the cornerstone of chinuch? We'll go back to our first point. Where does education begin? Education begins with the responsibility of the parents and the children. It starts at home. That's where it starts. Now, once you establish the responsibility of each individual and the responsibility of each parent, then you can then move on and say, okay, we know now that I as a parent carry the responsibility of educating my children. But what are we going to do as a community to support our parents? What are we going to do as a community to support our children? And that's where Yoshua ben Gamla and other such people who instituted the day school system, is because now once we had once we've established the responsibility of the individual, we can now move on to establish the responsibility of the community, of the public, of the plural. On a practical level, this makes us think, how much time do I actually devote to the chinuch and the education of my children? And to the grandparents out there who are listening and joining us, how much time do I spend on the chinuch and education of my grandchildren? In other words, is it just my role to focus on their physical needs, right? So they're healthy and they have financial stability and health stability. But it's also my role to focus on their education, and not just their secular education of their maths and sciences, but on their Torah education, or their davening, or their learning, or the Parsha. How many times do parents actually ask themselves this question? So it seems to me that sometimes we get carried away by Yoshua ben Gamla's suggestion, Jewish day schools. We get carried away by the sense of community. It's the community's responsibility to educate our children. Let's go back and realize that before we get to V'hayam Shamoa, before we get to the community, the plural, we started this whole discussion with V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha, V'shinantam levanecha. Right? Levanecha means your children, individual, not the public, not the plural yet. First, we start with a sense of responsibility within the community, within the individual family. Then we can go on to assess the responsibility within the community as well. And what do we say at the end of the paragraph of Vayam Shemoah? What do we say there? We say, Leman yirbo yameichem, in order to prolong your days, v'mei v'neichem, in the days of your children, al ha'adama, upon the land, asher nishba Hashem la'avotehem, that God has sworn to give to your forefathers, latet lahem, to give to them, kimei hashamayim, like the days of the heavens, al ha'aretz, over the earth. In other words, God had promised the forefathers that he would give us the promised land of Israel. And in order for you to have long days, and for your children to have long days, and to be able to live in Israel, we have to fulfill this dream of education, because Israel is dependent on Torah values. Israel is not just a state for the nation of Israel, it's a Torah country. It's a country that's based on Torah values. And the more we study the Torah, and the more we educate our children, the more we can pass it on to them, and the more we will deserve to live in Israel. Here we have an interesting verse. Ledaber bam. When we educate our children, it says, "V'limadtem otam et b'neichem ledaber bam." We teach our children to talk them, to speak about them. Ledaber bam. What does that mean? It means our children should start to talk it over, so that we don't just teach them and they're like parrots, right, who absorb. Our education is that our children should start to talk the words of Torah, that their lingo should be one of Lashon HaKodesh, the one of Torah, the one of Judaism. And in fact, that's what it says, that when a child starts to talk from a very young age, that is already the age that we start educating them. So the moment the child starts talking, we should start using that opportunity to encourage them to say phrases of Torah, whether it means to start brachot, that they should learn how to say a blessing and a bracha on their food or the mitzvah that they're engaged in, or we should teach them how to quote phrases. And it's amazing how children absorb things. It's amazing how they absorb. So we should use that opportunity to say psukim, to say the phrases, because when that becomes part of their DNA, when that becomes part of our relationship with our children, the one that we're able to educate them ourselves and bring them up in the Torah way, it remains with them forever and ever. So to address our question of today, must I do it all myself? In the realm of education, the answer is no, we don't have to do it all ourselves. We can appoint teachers, educators, schools, but it doesn't exempt me of my responsibility. The responsibility still remains mine. It's my job. I've got to do it. I then appoint the Jewish Day School to assist me. And that's a very, very different mindset to the mindset that says the community is responsible, the school is responsible, and I have no responsibility whatsoever. That's the message of today. Let's embrace it, because education can literally change our generation and generations to come. So thank you all for joining us today for Practical Parsha. Those of you on Zoom, if you want to stick around for a personal chat in a moment, please do. Those of you who are watching on Facebook or later on, have a wonderful day ahead.